Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. Thanks for joining us. 8.3% inflation. It's about the economy. But first, statewide elections. We'll get to those subjects and more after these words.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host, Terry Madonna.
Welcome back. We have a bunch of interesting subjects, and joining me to talk about them, Tom Lehman, Capitol reporter with WGAL News 8, and Brad Bumsted, Bureau Chief with the Caucus. All right, gentlemen, I'll tell you what, these statewide elections are not just being covered in the state of Pennsylvania, but they're getting a lot of national press coverage with people pouring into the state. Brad, let's start with you with an update on the governor's election. Republican candidate Doug Mastriano, Democratic candidate Josh Shapiro.
Yes, well, where it's at goes back to your initial comments about inflation. If any Republican candidate has a chance, it's driven by that inflation rate and the fact that it's a midterm election. We've seen some tightening in the race, but Shapiro still holds a lead. How sizable that is subject to debate. Real Clear Politics has it, I believe, at 6 or 7%.
Yeah.
But, you know, a recent poll by Emerson College came out and showed it a 2% difference. I mean, how can that be? Mastriano's not running a typical campaign. He's not talking to the press in Pennsylvania. And, you know, he's not doing any campaign advertising. He doesn't have any money.
Right.
So this is all the Trump base. Look, to win, Mastriano still has to get independent voters and swing voters in the Philadelphia suburbs.
Right.
That's a tough order for him. Even picking off Democrats is going to be tough.
Yeah, Tom, you've been following this race pretty closely. The fact of the matter is, in the last couple of weeks, Mastriano has moved away from sort of the subjects that were controversial about challenging the election results, getting into abortion and some other subjects. But now it looks like he's segueing into the economy and some other issues as well.
Sure, and I covered a couple rallies last week in which Mastriano was getting his base really fired up. I also was able to speak to him earlier this week at the March for Life. And on the economy note, at these rallies, that's been the focus. Rick Santorum, as well as Donald Trump Jr. at these rallies basically saying, hey, if you don't like the national Democratic agenda, we can do something about it here in Pennsylvania, and the economy was the main focus, and some other education issues as well. But one of the main tenets of that, again, is that economy. It's not abortion. I did talk with Mastriano about abortion, though, earlier this week, and he called it the #1 issue of our lifetime, though.
He doesn't back off of that.
No.
Did he back off of that?
He doesn't.
Yeah.
And
but let's state his position first.
It's a ban on abortions with no exceptions.
Exceptions at the heartbeat, right? Once you detect the heartbeat, not even to save the life of the mother. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. And I think, I asked him about that. I said, hey, a lot of people think that this is too extreme. And he simply said, hey, voters have a choice in November. They're going to decide in more than one way, especially when you consider that constitutional amendment and what some fear might be the effects of that. It's not just the governor's race. That's kind of what he was getting at.
But Terry, while there's been a slight shift by Mastriano to try to, focus on some other issues, in no way has he abandoned what he stood for in the primary.
Right.
And he hasn't really made a move to the middle like some candidates would do at this point. And I don't think he will do that. I don't think that's the way he is.
Yeah, but he's not talking about them nearly as much as he did earlier, correct?
Some of those issues, sure. I think he's trying to put out these sort of broader issues like, again, the economy. That's been the main focus. That's
crime?
Crime is another big one. He's been linking Josh Shapiro to some crime trends in Philadelphia. But, when you cover these rallies, when you hear the message that's being put out there, while it is sort of a broader message, it's one that is more targeted toward Republicans. Not necessarily a coalition-building one.
Well, you made a point earlier. It's tough to win just on what I call small-town and rural Pennsylvania voters because in numbers. You really need the suburban voters. Bucks, Chester, Montgomery, and Delaware counties down in the southeast. Here in this market, you got the suburbs of Lancaster, the suburbs of Harrisburg, the suburbs of York, just because of the sheer numbers.
And you have to shave Democratic votes off in certain areas. You don't have to win, you don't have to have a majority, but you have to have a couple 10,000 so that you are cutting the margin of the Democrat candidate.
He's got to expand the Trump base, which is the core of his support.
Yeah, and I mean, in covering both of those rallies, a few hundred people showed up. But the question is, were all these people going to vote for him already anyway? And that's really I think that's been the question that's been dogging him this entire race. Can he appeal to Democrats? Can he appeal to anybody beyond the primary voters?
All right. The it's a state U.S. Senate race, but it has national implications. I'll put it that way. Pennsylvania is considered one of the crucial states that could decide which party controls the United States Senate. Back after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
All right, the Democratic candidate for the United States Senate, the current Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania, John Fetterman. And how can I say this? The celebrity, Dr. Oz. Take it away there, Tom. What's going on?
Well, I think the race certainly, over the last couple of weeks, we've gone from talking about vegetable platters to, a potential debate coming up. And I think that's really been one of the things that people have been anticipating. I think it's definitely an issue that people have been wondering about. What is it going to happen? And it appears we're getting to that at this point. Fetterman, there's still a lot of questions about his health, and at the same time, Oz has really been just hammering him on crime and some other issues.
Well, the fact of the matter is, you've covered a lot of elections, and the question has been raised, even in the Washington Post, that Fetterman needs to be more transparent. He had a stroke a couple of days before the May primary, as everybody knows. He had a pacemaker put in. He has a heart problem. And he's not been transparent about his health, and that's come up in a major way. Oz has made a big deal of it, but reporters are now writing stories about it.
Right. He hasn't, really sat down and talked with reporters in a wide open format, and he hasn't released anything that I'm aware of from his doctors other than a cognitive test or something, but in terms of what it is with the after effects of the stroke. And, I think he'll need to do that. It's not really about the debate in this case. I don't think debates don't decide races in statewide races. They may in presidential races.
Sure.
They're not that big here. It's about, can you do this?
Can you do the job?
And can you even do the debate?
Yeah.
And that's what Oz has been hammering.
Yeah.
I think what's going on, though, in the bigger picture is that coming out of the primary, Fetterman had momentum.
Yes.
And he had, at one point, even an 11-point lead. And even with the stroke having hit him right before the primary, he held a lead all summer. He was doing well, with all his little internet jabs, his trolls going out and finding stuff about Dr. Oz. But in the past month, Dr. Oz has really taken the momentum on the health issue, but even bigger on the crime issue.
Yeah. And in Oz's case, he's had to struggle with the results of the primary, which he won narrowly over Dave McCormick. And, the celebrity, the carpetbagger, you're not one of us. I mean, that has really continued to linger on, and he's more unpopular in the polls than he's popular. It's called favorable and unfavorable. Go ahead.
Right, and that's, it's nothing new. Fetterman has been hitting him with the "you're not really from here" jabs since really even before the primary. I think the big issue right now is that he's been trying to say, okay, hey, don't worry about that. there's a lot of other issues we really need to be focused on, and that's really what he's been going after in the last few weeks, especially with the health issues with Fetterman, and also, more importantly, on this crime issue, which he's really been leaning into at the Trump rally and other events.
Right.
And he's had Fetterman on the defensive about these things. If you look at what happened on the health issue, when Oz first started bringing it up, Fetterman said he wasn't going to do any debates. But because he was pushing and then the press started covering it, then he said, well, I'll do one debate. And it turns out the one debate he'll do is after the mail-in voting has already started.
Yeah.
Right? So what's with that?
Yeah. Well, look, I want to thank you for coming on. A very important update. And I'll tell you, these elections, I think we've seen more coverage of it and more interest in it than perhaps any other statewide elections in recent decades. Would you both agree?
I would.
Yeah,
All right, coming up, it's about the state of the economy. That and more following these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, go to ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Well, it's the state of the economy. Dave Taylor, he's the president and CEO of Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association, joins me, expert on the economy. All right, David, I'll tell you what, 8.3% inflation. Are we going to slip into a recession? Everybody, I think, knows what the Federal Reserve did, raising the rate. I mean, the fact of the matter is, give us your estimate.
Well, I mean, I think the country already is in recession. We've had 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. We'll see what the third quarter performance is like in just a few weeks. But, there's no doubt that consumer confidence is very low. And certainly, as you mentioned, with the increases by the Federal Reserve and the interest rate, that that a bear market has taken hold and that assets are down. So, I mean, we're moving in the wrong direction. For sure. It's just the point I want to make, Terry, is that, all the decision makers, including myself, people of our cadre, we're all at least moderately well off. But there are a lot of people in our Commonwealth, in our country, who are living paycheck to paycheck. And when you have inflation galloping along at this rate and the people have higher utility bills and grocery bills and fuel bills, making it to the end of the month for a lot of people is getting more difficult. And this is why, these issues need to be addressed with great urgency.
That's a great point. You have 4 or 5% hike in wages, but an 8+ percent hike in inflation. The average folks are losing money, right?
People are losing purchasing power on their wages, and again, this is going to cause great grief and for people and societal pressure on America as a whole. And so we need to. I mean, obviously, we need to what do they say? When you're in a hole, stop digging. That the inflationary pressures of massive government spending in Washington has to come to an end. This is I think this is really one of the major issues of the upcoming election. To say, how do we get this under control?
And the other point about it, the inflation affects people in their daily lives when they go in, to buy, food in a grocery store.
Right.
If they can find the item that they want, the prices are up. When the gasoline prices are down, but they're still higher than they were a year ago. How about their electric bills, phone, all those kind of bills?
Right, exactly. And so, one of the major factors affecting inflation is the price of energy. And again, our argument in the business community has been that we need to maximize domestic production of our energy resources. In Pennsylvania, obviously, that's natural gas and the Marcellus shale play. And that because, every step of industrial activity requires using energy. When energy prices go up, all of those costs get compounded, and that's what drives up consumer prices.
Now, there are jobs. You can't go into a urban area or even a suburban area where there are shops and stores and other things. Help wanted, help wanted, help wanted, help wanted, help wanted.
Right.
And you and I were talking about that in the airline industry before we went on the air here.
And it's every bit as bad in the rural areas because you've got a smaller population in that part of the world, and the situation is pretty dire there also. You know, we need to help people to get back to work, whether that is, people needing transportation or childcare, whether it's helping people to upskill, to gain the ability to do the jobs that our economy is hungering for. But there's a lot of opportunity that's out there, and we just need to help connect people to those opportunities.
Yeah. All right, well, let's run to a break. When we come back, I want to talk about natural gas. It's a big part of the economy of the state of Pennsylvania. You know, there's division over it because of the environment. We can talk about that and more following these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine.
Well, back in the day, as they say, Pennsylvania was a huge part of the national industrial era. Coal, iron, steel, other metals were produced in our state, and it made us one of the leading states in terms of the Industrial Revolution. And now, as they've gone into decline, we have what? We have natural gas as a part of the economy.
Well, right. That's certainly natural gas and the related petrochemical manufacturing from natural gas is probably the greatest economic opportunity that we have here in the Commonwealth. And while we do still produce large amounts of industrial metals and industrial chemicals, all of those things require energy. And just again to remind the viewers how big the natural gas play is in Pennsylvania with the Marcellus Shale natural gas play, that we're talking about untold trillions of recoverable cubic feet of natural gas. It's one of the largest natural gas plays in the world, and that Pennsylvania has like more than 2/3 of it. So this is why we need to have a pro-production agenda in Harrisburg to help to bring that energy to the surface where it can benefit human beings. And that, so in northeastern Pennsylvania, along the New York state border, that there's a superabundance of natural gas that's pure. It doesn't need to be separated or processed, so it's ready to go for home heating and cooking, for electric generation, and for industrial furnaces. And this is another point that I want to make, Terry. There are many consumer goods that can only be made using industrial furnaces like glass. You've got to reach a very high temperature point that can't be reached with electricity. So again, people talking about that we're going to get rid of fossil fuels, well, that's nonsense, because things like ammonia, which we need for chemical fertilizers, things like cement that we need for basically any kind of construction, all these things require that very high temperature point that only natural gas can bring. But in southwestern Pennsylvania, along with the huge amount of methane, the natural gas, there are all these other chemicals that are extracted along with it: ethane, butane, pentane, and propane, among others.
Right.
And this is why we're so excited about the opportunity to use those chemicals as feedstocks for making stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is a big part, and it's also all over the place in our state, as you point out. It seems like natural gas is...
Yeah, the play is essentially under and everything to the north and west of the Allegheny Mountains. So it's a very broad footprint, but the real concentrations are up there in the northern tier, Susquehanna, Bradford,
Right.
And in the southwest, Washington and Greene and Beaver.
Now, the environmentalists have raised some concerns about it.
Yeah, they always do.
There's no sense in which, however, that that at the moment it's having an effect. Is it having any effect on natural gas production in the state?
Well,
Recovery?
I mean, the complaints and the fears that are stirred up by the radical Greens, obviously that makes it more difficult to generate, to sustain, broad public support for industrial activities. But the fact is, these processes are done more safely, more cleanly here in the U.S. and especially in Pennsylvania than in any other part of the world. So when you know about all of the goods that come from the petrochemical manufacturing process and how much of it we use, if you're for the environment, why wouldn't you want it to be done in the place where it's cleanest and safest?
Okay. Let's talk about natural gas manufacturing.
Right.
It's an element of this that I know you wanted to mention.
Yeah, and I wanted to speak to, again, the enormous opportunity that's before us, and that in particular that Pennsylvania Chemicals, Royal Dutch Shell, has an $8 billion facility in Beaver County, in Monaca, and that facility is, the construction's complete, and that it's going to go operational by the end of the year. And that when that facility is up and running, it's going to take that ethane, that gas from the Marcellus Play, it's going to turn it into ethylene and then polyethylene. And then polyethylene is at the top of a food chain that, depending on how you process it, can yield almost every kind of consumer good, plastic, rubber, styrofoam, paints, glazes, coatings, adhesives, things that go into all the products that we handle and purchase and use every day. That facility is going to crank out 1,600,000 tons of feedstock, tiny little plastic pellets smaller than an aspirin. And this is going to create basically an economic reason for manufacturers to want to locate in Western Pennsylvania, to have access to that feedstock. So, again, if we want to bring back prosperity and resurrect our brownfields, this is something that's big enough to actually make that happen. And so again, it comes back to what kind of environment are we creating for attracting that investment? And ultimately, it comes down to Harrisburg and the General Assembly and the governor. We need to have regulatory reform to streamline permitting so that these things move at the speed of business.
What's the situation with those individuals?
Well, I mean, we make it harder on ourselves than we should. The bad news is that we do all kinds of dumb things, but the good news is that we do it to ourselves, which means that we could stop if we wanted to.
Yeah, well, is it moving anywhere?
Moving how?
In the legislature?
Well, I mean, there are any number of proposals to, to help with this process. I don't think anything is going to move further this session. But I mean,
they have
again,
limited days in which
well,
they're
of
in
course.
session.
But again, these are the sorts of big issues that I think that statewide campaigns should be about, instead of the sort of usual nonsense that we see.
Look, I want to thank you for the update. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And as always, you stay well.